So the last few charts in this chapter are including the major ascending, which are sensory pathways, and the spinal cord tracts. And there's only a few I want you to know. Specifically, and most of them you know whether they're ascending or descending by the name, but there's a couple exceptions. And I'll highlight the important stuff that you need to know. So the two exceptions are the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. If I haven't highlighted it, then you can just ignore it. So the origin of those are beginning at a muscle in above the belt or below the belt. So really, the origin and the termination are not too important. They end up going to the thalamus and then to the somatosensory cortex. And remember, the somatosensory cortex is in the post-central gyrus. The function is what is the most important. Both of these tracts are going to transmit sensory impulses from general sensory receptors of the skin and proprioceptors, and they function in what's called discriminative touch, pressure, and body sense, limb and joint position. So that means if you had your eyes closed and somebody were to tickle your left foot with a feather, your fasciculus gracilis would sense that. So the fasciculus cuneatus is associated with upper limbs, upper trunk, and neck. The gracilis is lower limbs and inferior body trunk. So a little way to remember this is the fact that there is actually a muscle which is an abductor. It's on the inner thigh called the gracilis, and it's in the lower body. So this begins with receptors in the lower limbs and the inferior body trunk. So there's really no cuneatus muscle, but you can use the process of elimination. It begins with receptors in the upper limb, the upper trunk, and the neck. So again, those are the two exceptions to know. The rest of them should make more sense. So remember, I told you you don't have to know lateral, ventral, dorsal, and so on. So I'm crossing off lateral, ventral, dorsal, and ventral. What I do want you to know is spinothalamic and spinocerebellar, which I've kind of talked about a couple slides ago. So the termination of each is eventually the somatosensory cortex. They do go through the thalamus, the relay station. And the spinothalamic is concerned with pain and temperature. And the other spinothalamic is including touch and pressure, interpreted by the somatosensory cortex. So really, you can make an index card for the spinothalamic and just include the part that I highlighted. For the spinocerebellar, obviously they both go to the cerebellum, and they transmit impulses from the trunk and lower limb proprioceptors for subconscious proprioception. So it's subconscious proprioception, which is really the key as far as the function of the spinocerebellum. So those are the ascending or sensory tracts. The last slide is the descending or the motor tracts. And for this one, again, I'm going to first cross out the lateral, ventral that are present. We don't have them for the rest of them. But the corticospinal, we talked about it before. It's a super important one. And it's going to begin at the motor cortex of the cerebrum. Remember, you don't have to know pyramidal cells, so you can ignore that. But it influences motor neurons, and its main function is to transmit motor impulses from the cerebrum to spinal cord motor neurons. And it's a voluntary motor tract. So this is very important because in comparison to the spinocerebellar tract, that one was subconscious proprioception. This one is a descending voluntary motor tract. The tectospinal tract begins from the superior colliculus of the midbrain. So as long as you know what the function of the superior colliculus, you should be fine. It's responsible for turning the head so the eyes can follow a moving object. Remember that that is basically the tracking reflex. So can you track a moving object? The vestibulospinal, you'll have the term vestibular when we get to special senses, but it begins with vestibular nuclei in the medulla of the brainstem. It transmits motor impulses that maintain muscle tone, and it activates ipsilateral limb and trunk extensor muscles that move the head, but most importantly, it maintains balance during standing and movement. And the word vestibule in the inner ear has to do with equilibrium. So that should make sense to you. The rubrospinal transmits motor impulses concerned with muscle tone of distal limb muscles, mostly flexors, on the opposite side of the body. So the functions are largely assumed by the corticospinal tract. So it's very similar. Reticulospinal, again, you don't need to know the medial and lateral, but you should know that its impulse is concerned with muscle tone and many visceral motor activities. And control is over most unskilled movements.